And we're off. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Yankus. I am a senior instructional designer for the Division of Continuing Studies at Rutgers University. You are here today to learn a little bit about an introduction to teaching online. So perhaps you work with educators who will be obviously confronting this idea for the first time, and some of us are here not willfully necessarily. This is a new way of thinking and a new way of teaching for a lot of people. And we want to make sure that we provide resources to you on how to approach that thoughtfully and make the experience just better overall for your students. So before I begin, obviously some of you may not be familiar with who I am or who my group is at Rutgers University. So I wanted to spend just a second introducing the Division of Continuing Studies, who has entered into a partnership with the New Jersey School Board Association. So if you are a board member and you're taking mandated trainings that are now moving online, that is happening as part of the collaboration between my unit, the Rutgers Division of Continuing Studies, and the New Jersey School Board Association. We refer to ourselves as DOCS because we love acronyms at Rutgers, but we are the Central Continuing Education Unit at Rutgers. We serve a very wide range of learners from ages 4 to over 100 years old. One of our token programs is the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, where we have folks of all ages, but for that particular institute, it's mostly senior citizens, come to our Lifelong Learning Center, which is pictured there, and take classes, whether it be in art, or whatever it might be, or just some history classes or classes where they might watch a movie and comment on it. So we offer a lot of great programming. And we also support distance learning for faculty and staff at the university to support our students. And if you're interested in learning more about docs, you can visit our website at docs.rutgers.edu. So I work for a unit within the Division of Continuing Studies that supports distance learning. So we run all sorts of workshops and trainings for faculty and staff at Rutgers University on the topic you're learning about today, among a number of others as well. Which leads me into who am I and why am I qualified to talk to you today? As I mentioned, my name is Joe Yankus. I'm a senior instructional designer at Rutgers University, and I serve the faculty and staff developing face-to-face, online, and hybrid courses. And what that means is that we work with folks on the full design cycle of bringing their content online. So we start in the ideation phase and help them work through mapping out their course, what it will look like online, and how to bring that programming online. In particular, my favorite areas to focus on are non-credit course design in continuing ed and academic video production, and all those wonderful mandated trainings you may be taking in Canvas as part of the NJSBA mandated online training for board members. I'm part of the team who puts that together, along with Marcia Levine from NJSBA, who is joining me today. She will be monitoring the chat throughout this presentation. As you enter the room, you may have noticed that you were muted, and you will be muted for the first 30, 40 minutes or so as I run through this presentation. If you have any questions, certainly don't hesitate to enter them into the chat. Marcia may answer some of them, or if not, I will handle all questions at the conclusion of the presentation. So certainly utilize that chat function if you're interested in, if anything comes to mind while I'm running through this presentation, don't hesitate to enter those thoughts into the chat. And I would love to have a discussion about some of these topics at the conclusion here. So you are here, again, intro to online teaching, right? So let's talk for just a second about what our objectives are for today and what I hope that you will walk away from by 3 o'clock. We're first going to identify the challenges of online instruction. So some of the challenges you'll face, perhaps, when developing online content for the first time, recognizing the unique needs of online students, and then explaining strategies on how to address those needs, as well as describing the components of a successful online course. So that's kind of the rundown of what we're going to get into today. And let's just jump right into it, right? We're already at 2:07, and I've spent enough time talking about myself and the Division of Continuing Studies. But part one, right? The online classroom. What is the online classroom, and what does it look like? The first thing I want you to walk away from this with is that the online classroom is not the same thing as the traditional classroom. And our goal at Rutgers, when we're working with faculty, and certainly this descends down to K-12 and any online learning environment, it is just not the same as the traditional classroom. So our goal is not to just transpose a face-to-face course as is to an online setting. Now, amidst the pandemic, some of that may be happening, right? We had to handle on a very rapid timeline moving content online. So perhaps the level of thoughtfulness and care that normally goes into this process of transitioning content online may just not have happened right now. But as we start thinking perhaps more long term about online learning, not just in response to a pandemic, but just as making this a good experience for our students overall, we want to start thinking about opportunities to rethink and redesign our courses. So, what does that mean? That means taking a look at your content. That means taking a look at the activities that you may have been doing face to face and think, does this make sense to do it online? If it doesn't, what can we do to make it better or to alter the modality of the particular activity? And how can we capitalize on the features of a learning management system to create an engaging online learning experience for all of our students, whether they be 4 years old, 5 years old, 15, 17, 18, or in my case, 90 perhaps. So there are concepts here and ideas that hit every age range in terms of learning. And this presentation is inherently, I try to avoid recommending a specific tool or a specific platform because I recognize that the districts you may be working with all have different technological infrastructures. So while at Rutgers University we use Canvas, the learning management system, I recognize some of you using Google Classroom or something else. And I've tried to keep this purposefully vague in terms of technology because a lot of these learning platforms that you may be using do have similar features. The button might be in a different place or the tool might be called something different, but I want to present to you just some general ideas for you to consider when transitioning instruction to online. Part two, the 5 needs of online students. Now, these needs may not necessarily be exclusive to online students. Obviously, every student may have some of these needs that you're about to see. However, some of these needs become particularly apparent and important when we are designing online content. And need number one is technical guidance. You want to assume that your students know nothing about navigating an online course. So whether you're using Google Classroom or Canvas or any system at all, you need to make sure that there is technical guidance in place to help your students get to where they need to be and learn what they need to learn. We don't want to create technological barriers that prevent our students from getting to the content they need because we as instructors or educators did not provide them with the guidance they needed to get where they had to go. And I know it's easy. I mean, I personally, I have a 13-year-old sister, and while she could probably do dances around my head technologically with certain things, and maybe I am prone to assume that she'll figure it out and she'll know what to do, it's still important that for every student that whether they use it or not, they have access to things like a course essentials learning module or a getting started module. So if your district or institution does have a learning management system of some sort where you can insert learning modules or content pages or anything of the like, you might want to consider composing a getting started or course essentials module that houses a lot of that clear technical guidance and tutorials. Now, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. These don't necessarily have to be homegrown tutorials or things like that. It could simply be that you did your due diligence in providing a link to documentation for the platform of your choice. If you're asking students to use Flipgrid, for example, as a video discussion tool, making sure that they have access to the documentation on what Flipgrid is and how to use it, whether that be on a mobile phone or on their computer. So main idea, make sure that technical guidance is available for all students for any and all of the different technologies that you're using. And don't assume that your students know exactly what it is and how to get to it and how to use it. Again, whether they use it or not, we want to make sure that that information is available. Now, what you're seeing here is a screenshot of a Canvas course. So again, at Rutgers, we use Canvas, so you're going to see some Canvas screenshots in this particular presentation. But let's generalize this and let's assume this could be a Google Classroom or this could be something else. And here's an example of bad technical guidance, right? So I'm a student, I've landed on this course homepage, and I'm welcomed. That's it. No one has told me or given me guidance on where to find the learning materials, where to find the content. Maybe there's a conference being hosted here in the class that I have to log into, and I have not the slightest clue how to get there because no technical guidance was provided on how to do so, right? Versus good technical guidance. So here's another example of a Canvas course homepage. You see that there's still a nice little welcome there, but there's some other contextual information, such as the semester of spring 2017, a little old, and some instructor info, course description, all course content is available via modules. There's a link right there that directs students to the modules page, which they might not even know what that word means, but that tells them that all course content is available via modules. So even if I've never touched Canvas before and I log into this course, I am now aware of where, at least at minimum, where I have to go to get started. And in this case of the screenshot, that would be the modules page. So technical guidance, make sure that that is available in any content that you're sharing in your course. Need number 2, frequent communication. Now, again, I mentioned before that some of these needs are applicable to face-to-face and online. The need for frequent communication comes inherent for educators in a face-to-face classroom because, especially in K-12, you usually see those students every day or a couple of times a week, and you have that opportunity to engage with them face-to-face and perhaps handle some of the housekeeping items, such as reminding them that there's a test next week or that they have to turn in a paper at the start of the week next, whatever it might be. Online, it's not the same case. Your students are not walking into your classroom every day, and whereas you may have spent the first 3 minutes of class going over certain details in a face-to-face class. How do we translate that online, where we are more content focused of, okay, let me build this learning module, let me upload this resource, let me share this file, but where do all the other logistics come in and little housekeeping items that we would handle face-to-face? Well, in Canvas at Rutgers University, we handle that through announcements. And there's an announcement tool in Canvas, and again, probably on the other platforms that you may be using, or it could be as simple as an email. If your K-12 teachers have a distribution list of some sort of parent email addresses or student email addresses, the main idea here is to make sure that students are engaged with frequently, whether that be just one email per week or more, and supplying context for the coming week's material, maybe personal touches, and avoiding boilerplate messaging. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So here's an example of bad communication, right? This is for a course I teach at Rutgers University, and you see my announcement just kind of mentions what's coming in that particular week, and that's about it, right? It doesn't have any sort of personal touch. It doesn't remind the students that you are a real person, a real teacher who is looking at the work they're submitting and engaging with them in different ways. This here is very boilerplate, right? Versus this, what I would consider an example of good communication, where I, as the instructor, took the time to add a little bit of personal touch. And again, this is kind of structured around a higher ed model, but last week's discussion on this was particularly engaging for this reason, or whatever the case may be. Just making sure that that personal touch remains and that students are reminded that you, as a teacher, are actively engaged with the material that you're teaching to them, and you're engaged with the work they are submitting and the discussions that you are facilitating with them. So I hope you recognize the difference between something that seems a little more boilerplate versus something that looks like it was a little more thoughtfully composed. Need number 3, directions, right? And this is, again, something that would benefit both face-to-face and online instruction, right? Providing direction and context around the material that you are housing online. So one of the pitfalls we see in online ed, in higher ed at Rutgers, is sometimes that instructors, educators will just kind of throw files online, right? So they think of an online course as just a file dump, and then they'll just throw a PowerPoint and throw a video and throw a PDF file, and it just becomes a messy dump of files that are not organized. There's no context around what those mean, and it takes from this experience overall. So something such as a module or a learning introduction can help students manage their time, and then that can provide transparency on what's to come in a particular week. So providing an overview of the week with a list of assignments and due dates, and I imagine this is especially important in K-12, is super important. And again, this might be something that typically you would have handled face-to-face by just verbally reminding students of certain things. But online, if you don't share that information, it doesn't get to the students. So this is an example of a learning module in the Canvas learning management system that I consider to be a bad layout. It has just a page, it has an activity, and sure, it's organized, but how can we do it better? We house it within context, right? So again, in this particular example, we're looking at Canvas, and this is a learning module from an adult learning course, an introduction to adult learning. You see there's an activity table, something as simple as just breaking down what day something is due and reminding them how much weight a particular activity carries. These minor thoughts and this minor attention to detail really goes a long way in providing a transparent experience overall for your students. So whereas this is just kind of a list of stuff, a list of readings and an activity and et cetera, this provides some contextual framework around it that reminds the student about why they're learning a particular idea, why they're being introduced to this, where perhaps it falls within the larger class structure for the entire school year, and whatever the case may be. The main idea here is just providing that context for them and making sure that the content that you disseminate online is organized, and that there's transparency in the activities that you're conducting in terms of due date, weight, etc. On this same token, so also still thinking about that need to provide directions to your students, setting clear guidelines and expectations for each assignment, including, and I especially draw your attention to this last one, online discussions. Again, especially COVID-19 craziness that we're dealing with right now, we have very quickly transformed how we are teaching and how students are engaging with each other. It used to be happening face to face. At the drop of a hat, it is now happening online, and students are navigating waters that they've never had to before. And things such as written online discussions is brand new to them, perhaps. And you need to think about making sure that students are clear on what qualifies as a satisfactory post to a discussion forum, what qualifies as a satisfactory post to a video discussion platform such as Flipgrid. Do they need to record a 15-second video? Do they need to record a 4-minute video? For a written discussion, do they need to write 50 words, 100 words, 200 words? Do they need direct quotes? So some of the same things that you may have included in rubrics and grading standards in a face-to-face classroom, we need to think about what this looks like online. So again, as a former fully online student myself, I had obviously different instructors and different educators teaching me fully online. And for the example of a discussion forum, in one class, a 2-paragraph response to a discussion got me a full 100 points on that particular discussion assignment, versus a different class where perhaps I had to write 5 paragraphs. So the expectation needs to be set from the start, and that needs to be transparent to the students. So just make sure that guidelines on any assignment that you conduct online, whether it be a discussion or something else, that any rubric you're using to score or things like that are available to students, or at least it's made clear to them what they are expected to do, especially for assignment types and activity types that you would not have been doing face-to-face and that students are now doing online for the first time. Here's an example of a bad discussion prompt. So again, you're looking at a screenshot from Canvas, and Canvas has a discussion forum tool, as I assume most learning platforms do. And you see that I have asked my students to discuss this week's readings and how they relate to you. Be specific. Vague, right? Doesn't really give students much to go on what you're asking of them. There is no guidance provided here on if I can just write a sentence and walk away, or if I need to write more, versus in 200 to 300 words, answer the following questions. So just providing, again, more framework around what you're expecting of your students in a particular activity. And you're giving them just a small range to hit on. So they know that, okay, I wish to receive a full 100 points or whatever it may be on this discussion activity, I need to make sure I at least hit 200 to 300 words, and I need to include at least one direct quote. So I have provided that transparency, which again goes a long way, especially for activities that students were not doing face-to-face and are having to figure out how to do online for the first time. Okay, we're up to need number 4 out of 5, and then we have one more section to get through, and then hopefully we'll still have time for a little Q&A at the end. Need number 4, feedback. Online students need robust, frequent, and timely feedback. Now, what does that mean, right? And again, this is something that I'm sure that as an educator would do in a K-12 face-to-face classroom, right? Just making sure that the feedback they provide on assignments and activities are in full, right? They're not just a grade. It's not just a numbers written on top of a piece of paper and thrown back to a student. It's thoughtful. If there's written feedback, perhaps audio and video feedback, if a platform supports it. The role of the instructor in an online course tends to, by nature of the platform, be slightly more invisible, right? Unless the instructor really works to make sure that their presence is known in a fully online class. It can be tough, right? So we have to make sure that we take every opportunity we can to remind the students that the instructor remains there and that they are providing thoughtful feedback on the assignments that they conduct online. Now, obviously, in the case of how we're responding to COVID-19 and that synchronous learning sessions are just being held fully online, obviously there is still instructor presence there, right? It's not like a fully online course where the instructor is only communicating via written message or recorded videos. If you're hosting these synchronous sessions fully online, there is still instructor presence, right? We can acknowledge that there is that presence still there, but there are other ways that we can still continue to remind our students that we are there and that we are engaged. And again, thoughtful feedback and doing so in a timely manner really does go a long way in an online course. I always bring up my own example of participating in a fully online degree program where I had instructors who would disappear for weeks. I would submit work, I would not hear back for 4 to 5 weeks, and then I suddenly receive all of my grades in just numeric format with absolutely no feedback, right? So that carries weight, and it makes a big difference for the learner to not just obviously receive a score, but to understand where that score came from on a particular activity. And again, here's an example of bad feedback, just a score and good job, versus more solid feedback where the instructor took a moment to actually compose some sort of written comment back to the student, and perhaps in a case where an instructor actually really would have time to do it, would be to like record a video or an audio comment of some sort. So these little touches do indeed go a long way. And need number 5, active learning. So I mentioned this before that online learning, online ed can be very isolated and lonely for students at times. And there are opportunities that we can take online to promote interaction and active learning and doing our best to make sure that students stay engaged with one another, especially during this time in particular. And there are ways to do that synchronously and asynchronous. So synchronously, obviously K-12 is using a lot right now, and the web conferencing, so whether that's on Zoom or WebEx or some other platform, a lot of obviously courses are being conducted through this method right now, fully online, and that gives students an opportunity to connect with their teacher and to still receive education synchronously and hopefully in a way that still retains what would have been done face to face and that nothing is lost in that transition. There are other features available usually in a learning platform such as text-based chat, and then asynchronous learning opportunities such as discussion forums, virtual group workspaces, and collaborations. The main idea is, again, this environment, this new online learning environment can be isolating at times if it's not executed properly by the instructor and there isn't, if it lacks a thoughtful approach where an instructor is trying to facilitate opportunities for students to engage with one another and engage with the teacher, things can be lost, right? And hosting a Zoom meeting for 2 hours and just running through a PowerPoint deck or some sort of learning material in that fashion might not be the only answer. And in a ideal world where we had time to prepare for this and to prepare for this thoughtfully, perhaps that would not be the only response. Um, there are different ways and different active learning methods to try to make sure that we engage with our students and that they engage with each other, so that they are not just at home watching a Zoom meeting. And I'm sure some of you have seen, how some students are responding to this, and with hosting with having to participate in a Zoom meeting where they set their virtual background on Zoom as a photo of themselves, and they just get up and walk away, right? So our classes hopefully can be designed in a thoughtful way that is not something that someone can very easily do, right? That if I walk away from my lecture that I'm sitting in on for an hour and a half, that nobody notices, right? So again, we're dealing with this live and very quickly. So perhaps there are ways that we can think about doing this better as we start thinking about if this extends beyond just the spring or this academic school year. So part 3, I got one part left of this, and that is the 3 components of a successful online course. And the first part of that is a measurable learning objective, right? And whether this is for you as the teacher, whether this is for your district or lesson plans, or this is information that's being shared with your students, I acknowledge that this process may look a little different in K-12. Again, I deal with this in higher ed all the time, where we have to run through the task of composing course level learning objectives and module level learning objectives. Now, this may be something that's required in K-12 or as part of lesson planning, I'm unsure, but in higher ed, this is something we confront all the time, having to write brief, clear, and specific measurable goals that describe learning that occurs by the end of, in a higher ed sense, the course in K-12, perhaps by the end of the academic school year. And when I say module level learning objectives, again, translating from higher ed to K-12, we're talking about units of study or a particular week in a semester. In K-12, that may be at the end of a week or whatever formatting that is used for lesson planning, whether that's done on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. But the main idea here, K-12 or higher ed or not, is this idea of measurable outcomes that students will obtain from a particular week's material or a particular unit's material, and those week level, unit level, module level learning objectives, whatever you may want to call them, should tie in obviously to the course level or academic year level learning objectives overall. And something we use as instructional designers at Rutgers when we assist faculty and staff with composing these learning objectives is this idea of Bloom's taxonomy. It may be something you're familiar with, or perhaps this is a new idea to you. This is a pyramid that essentially ranks levels of thinking within a pyramid, starting at the bottom with remembering, so asking students to define a particular term or list this or memorize that or reproduce something, climbing up to the top level of thinking, of creating something, where you're asking students to construct or design or develop something in response or in consideration of whatever material that you are teaching in that particular course. Then there's all the levels in between of analyzing, applying, etc. So as we construct learning objectives in higher ed, these levels of thinking and these action verbs are something that we certainly keep in mind as we are being thoughtful in what we're covering in a particular week and how that translates to course level learning objectives. A good learning objective would be, and you saw these at the beginning of this presentation, explain strategies to address the needs of your online students, right? And again, in higher ed, we share our learning objectives with our students. So, at the beginning of the week's learning module, we list out the 4 or 5 learning objectives for that particular week. Perhaps this is something you do in K-12 or perhaps not, but either way, it can be helpful in the planning process for the course. So you see that this particular learning objective is prefixed with the word explain, which is a measurable action verb that comes from the understanding level of the Bloom's taxonomy. Now, a bad learning objective would be to say that a student must understand strategies to address the needs of your online students. The word and the verb understand is not measurable. So we really try to avoid broad and unfocused action verbs when we talk about learning objectives. And what constitutes understanding is open to interpretation, right? So how do I measure that someone understands something? How do you assess the fact that your student understands strategies to address the needs of your online students versus being able to assess their ability to explain strategies to address the needs of your online students? Explain is a measurable action verb versus understand, which is more broad and unfocused. So component number two is backwards course design. So we focus on what we want students to learn to do and not the material itself. So it's beginning with the end goal and being thoughtful in designing activities and providing resources to students based on our learning outcomes and based on our learning objectives that we have constructed. So it's starting backwards and you know having the big picture in mind and designing based on that. And again, this is something that is probably already happening in K-12 and face-to-face courses, but it's definitely something to keep in mind when designing online as well. And finally, chunking, presenting your material in a paced and digestible format. When I say this, I'm referring to whether it be a video or whether it be a reading of some sort, whatever it may be. Students are engaging with content differently online than when you have them face to face. So in a brick and mortar classroom, they're with you for 8 hours or they're with you for a class period. And during that time, they are yours to do whatever it is that you want them to do, whatever lesson plan you have for that day. We have to acknowledge that online, that's a little different, right? If I'm a student and I'm sitting in my living room, that experience, that learning experience looks a lot different than when I am in a classroom for 8 hours or 4 hours or an hour and a half, or for a class period. And we have to acknowledge that students are going to be engaging this in more kind of cut off way where I may sit and look at this for a few minutes and I get distracted and then I come back to it later. In the case of a child, I think of my 13-year-old sister again. Perhaps she was interrupted and asked to do a chore, and that stopped her from doing her homework or from watching a video that you posted online for them to review. So because they're doing this online and they're not in the learning environment of a school, we have to be mindful of that and chunk our content in a way that it is digestible, and that if I have to walk away from this for 5 minutes and I come back, I'm not totally lost because I'm picking up on a 2-hour lecture, right? It was thoughtfully chunked where I could perhaps watch one 5-minute video or one 10-minute video and then come back and pick up a second piece of that later. So versus having to, think about it like watching a short video that was thoughtfully designed as a short video versus trying to watch a movie and then having to pause that movie and walk away and come back and remember where you were when you stopped. So being thoughtful on how we chunk our content when disseminating it online really goes a long way. So I'm wrapping up here a little earlier than I wanted to, but I wanted to leave you with a few takeaways. And I actually wrote these today. This presentation is something I developed a little while ago, but this slide here is something I wrote today, thinking specifically about the challenges we're facing right now amidst this COVID-19 pandemic. And the top one there is really important to me, recognizing the difference between emergency preparedness and teaching continuity amidst a pandemic versus a fully thought out and well-designed online course. I look at the things we're doing at Rutgers right now, and I imagine this is similar in K-12, and I see that we have responded well to the situation in front of us, right? But that does not mean that what we are currently doing is a fully thought out and well-designed online course, right? So we have responded to a pandemic, and in a few short weeks, we moved to fully online instruction, and that's an applaudable outcome, right? We responded and we moved quickly and we got a lot done. But our work is not done, and we have to recognize that what we are doing online currently in many cases at Rutgers and beyond, and I'm sure throughout the state of New Jersey and elsewhere, is a response to a pandemic. And if we were doing this in a thoughtful way, like I typically do with instructors I work with at Rutgers, some things may look a little differently. So just recognize that perhaps the emergency response and the way that we instituted teaching continuity in a very rapid way does not necessarily reflect what a well thought out and well designed online course is and what potential it has. So, my biggest fear in this is that some folks, whether it be students or teachers alike, are getting a bad impression of what online education is and can be because they are seeing what it was in response to a pandemic when a teacher was told that next week or the week after or whenever that they now have to teach fully online. And then just to wrap up, obviously be present. I mentioned before a few times now that online learning can be inherently lonely. So making sure that as a teacher, you are present in your course, whether that is through synchronous opportunities such as a Zoom call or a WebEx meeting, or via email, via announcements, via robust feedback to your students, whatever it may be present. And finally, be thoughtful in your design, again, especially when transitioning existing face-to-face activities to fully online ones. So just making sure that in the future, we can hope that we are all back in our normal routine, at Rutgers come fall or come next academic school year in September. But in the event that we are thinking more about online ed then, hopefully having time to be a little more thoughtful in how we go about conducting some of the activities and disseminating certain resources to our students. And that's all I've got. So I've listed my email here, joseph.yankus@rutgers.edu. If you have any questions about anything that we discussed today, certainly don't hesitate to send me an email. Many of you know Marcia. I've listed her email here as well, mlevine@njsba.org. You can reach out to her as well with any questions that you may have.
There are some questions in the chat room. Hello, everybody. This is Marcia Levine with New Jersey School Boards. I'm going to actually read off the one to you. Part of it we're going to actually send out to the individual who asked the question. Mm-hmm. For Peter, how do you ensure students stay engaged during distance learning, K-12 students? What does the research say about distance learning versus face-to-face instruction in the classroom in terms of student educational outcomes? Peter, I want to let you know that Vince DeLucia, our educator in residence, is actually working on putting together that information for you, and he'll be emailing you what the research says in support of distance learning at this time. Joe, I don't know if you want to field that first part of the question about keeping students engaged.
Yeah, and again, I preface this with the fact that I do primarily work with adult learners, so I absolutely recognize that trying to keep a 5-year-old engaged is very different than trying to keep a 55-year-old engaged. I hope that some of these ideas are broad enough that it can apply to all, but the first thing that comes to mind is just designing activities, right? Going back to that idea of active learning that I spoke about a few minutes ago, and we deal with this in higher ed all the time. That it's not just an instructor sage on the stage, standing in front of a room, or in the case of what we're dealing with right now, sitting on a Zoom call and talking for 7 hours. That is not a model in which I believe keeps anyone engaged, whether they are 5 years old or whether they are 55 years old. So, trying to think through different activities, and part of that does require being informed enough about the technology available to you to be able to design such an activity, right? So, we our model with teaching faculty and staff at Rutgers how to do things online is twofold. It's pedagogically, how do we do this well, but also technologically, how do we do this well? So again, this presentation was purposefully vague when it comes to technology because every district is different. But I think it's important as an educator to know what tools are in their arsenal at their district. I think Marcia was telling me the other day that her daughter was doing a Flipgrid video, right? And that's a video discussion tool. So if that's available in a particular district, I mean, that's a free tool, so that should be available to everyone. But just knowing the tools that are available to help you facilitate meaningful and thoughtful activities that can keep your students engaged. That's kind of a very long-winded response to that, but.
Yeah, I would throw out there the other piece is differentiating how you're doing it, which all of the teachers already do. You do it in person. It's just figuring out which tools will allow you to do that online. And that leads into the next question Joe, which is often younger students usually are given verbal instructions in the classroom. Written instructions may be difficult for them considering their reading levels, so the parents and guardians are following the written instructions. What if a parent or guardian does not understand written English? Are there any translation services on any platforms?
That's a very good question. And again, when I'm dealing with adult learners, this isn't something I personally have to consider often, right? Because the students I'm dealing with are 18 and older. But for a younger student who's relying on a parent to perhaps read them instructions in English, I can't speak to the technology available at everyone's specific district. Obviously, there are broad tools such as Google Translate, which can, obviously you can just paste instructions in and translate those to the parents' language of choice. But I mean, Marcia, do you have anything to add on top of that?
At NJSBA, we actually did use a translation tool to take one of our pamphlets and translate it into Spanish. I don't know which one we used, but I can find that out and let the individual know. I apologize, I didn't say your name because it says owner, so I'm not sure who that is. Um, um, if you want to send me your email with this question, I can get you some information on what we used at NJSBA to translate pamphlets and things like that. I do think that the Google Translate is going to be your easiest free option that's out there right now for districts. Because the idea behind this is not to have you go out and spend any money on anything, but to use what's accessible. And I know that that's there. If I find out anything else, we will be taking this video and uploading it to the agenda. We'll also add some FAQs. So as this is one of the questions, as I find out more information on what's out there, we can list it in the FAQ. You can always come back and check that for yourselves. Okay.
And this actually leads into another point that I didn't cover in this particular presentation, but one of the things that we have to think about doing a lot of this online is accessibility, right? And that is something that we, obviously deal with in face-to-face and accommodations and whatnot. But online, there are new considerations for accessibility. So we work at Rutgers constantly with instructors to make sure that they are uploading content that is accessible, right? So in the event of someone who's hearing impaired, or even someone who just wants to read a video, read the transcript of a video versus watching it. So perhaps in the case of a student who does not speak English as well, or has a parent who's helping watch a video, who's having a hard time just listening to to a video that you post, making sure that the resources you post are accessible. So that means not just uploading a 5-minute video of you talking, but also uploading a 5-minute video that either includes captions or a transcript. And there are ways that we handle that at Rutgers with tools that we have available, but everyone has access to YouTube, right? And obviously there's issues of confidentiality there, but you could upload a video to YouTube, make it unlisted, and that way is not searchable, but making sure that you use the captioning tool that is built into YouTube to edit the machine captions that are generated to make sure they are accurate, right? So every video that goes to YouTube that you upload will be run through machine captioning. So being mindful and trying to take the time to edit those captions is another way that we can make sure that the content we share multimedia-wise is accessible. And other ideas such as making sure that PDFs are readable PDFs, right? So that if a student has to use a screen reader to parse through a resource you share, that screen reader can read through that document. And there's my colleague is Marcia, is that happening right now or happening again? The accessibility one, and so there are a lot of considerations with accessibility that we're actually.
And the accessibility is happening now, Joe.
Yeah, so that recording will be available, and I do recommend that you check it out. There are a lot of considerations with making online content accessible, so definitely check that out.
That's all the questions we have in the chat. If anybody has any questions,
wait, I think there's one more, Marcia. I think so. Any advice on how to make sure that major exams are held to the same academic integrity standard that would be expected as if it was an in-class test?
That's a perfect someone to attend the assessment session that's happening at 3:30.
Yeah, so my colleague is running a session on alternate assessment in the 3:30. She's running it right now, but running it again at the 3:30 session. The main idea, Patrick, to address your question, is that I have not personally encountered a perfect proctoring tool, right? Rutgers has a number, we have a number of proctoring tools in our arsenal at Rutgers University, and those are ones that we pay for, right? So I can't even guarantee that in a particular school district there would be access to this. So there are obviously there's Turnitin, right? That would be a tool that we would use for a written submission of an essay to make sure students aren't plagiarizing. That's a pretty widely known and widely used one, I think, even in K-12. Patrick, you mentioned you're a student at Rutgers and you've used ProctorTrack. So for those of you that do not know, a ProctorTrack is a proctoring tool that is a program that installs on your computer, and it basically watches you take your test. It's a machine proctoring tool that records your screen as you take an exam, and what it does is it flags for the instructor any sort of thing that it deems a red flag. So are you doing this? Are you like scribbling notes or looking at something, or are you constantly looking down at notes or looking away? Do you get up and leave? Does somebody walk up to you and say, "Oh, the answer is B," whatever it might be? It flags those violations for the instructor to then to look at later and determine if there is indeed an academic integrity issue here. There are other tools such as Respondus Lockdown Browser. That tool will lock down your web browser, but in 2020, we all have these, right? Or we have a tablet, or so locking down the web browser on my computer is not necessarily going to stop me from cheating. So every proctoring tool that we have at our disposal, there are holes in it, right? Even with ProctorTrack, right? I mean, I've seen videos online on Instagram of students who are using who have to use ProctorTrack, and then they're taping notes to around their monitor. So it still looks like they're looking at the camera and still taking the exam on the computer, but really they're leaning off to the left and reading all their written notes. So the short answer is there is no proctoring tool that I can tell you today that I believe guarantees 100% academic integrity. Students will always find a way, and the tools that we have in our I can never guarantee 100% academic integrity. The only way I could really push towards that number would be to be thoughtful in alternate ways of assessing students that makes it more difficult for them to cheat, right? So obviously it's easy for me to just paste my notes around my screen, and if it's a multiple choice test, say, okay, that definition matches up with answer B, and run through the exam. However, if my teacher came up with an alternate assessment that requires me to actually apply the knowledge rather than just regurgitate the knowledge, then it's more difficult. So all those notes around me don't matter because I have been asked to now, in a thoughtful way, analyze and perhaps discuss something different than just responding to a multiple choice exam. So that's all being covered. I don't want to spoil too much. That'll be covered in the 3:30 session with my colleague who's running a session on alternate assessment. But even at Rutgers, the 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 official word at the university level is to consider alternate assessment if you must do standardized testing in the form of, and I know that word means something different in K-12 than in higher ed, but if you must do a standard exam of ABCD, true, false, use proctoring tools, but acknowledge the fact that there really is no tool that's going to guarantee that academic integrity. Again, another long-winded response to a short question, but we're at 2:51. There's about 9 minutes left. I believe that everyone's questions in the chat were addressed, but I want to make sure that if anyone wants to, at this point, unmute themselves and verbally pose a question or continue entering questions in the chat, I just want to make sure everyone's questions get answered before we call it. Okay. All right. So I think we're relatively good. I will certainly hang out here for a few minutes in the chat, and if you think of a question and you just want to hang out and see if any other questions come through, certainly feel free. My contact info is on the slide here, so I'll pause my screen and make sure that stays there for the rest of the call. If you have no other questions, I'd like to thank you for joining me for this session on how brief introduction on how to teach online. There are 3 more sessions running at 3:30 p.m. So whether you are in my session on video lecture capture or in one of my colleagues, I'd like to thank you for joining me, and have a great day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.